Can you give me warp 8?
Aye, sir. And maybe a wee bit more. I'll sit on the warp engines myself and nurse them.
That position, Mr. Scott, would not only be unavailing, but also undignified.
Leonard Nimoy is the face most people picture when they hear the word Spock, the cool-headed Vulcan whose raised eyebrow and razor-sharp logic helped turn Star Trek into a pop culture language of its own. The funny part is that behind the calm stare and the famous hand salute, Nimoy's relationship with Spock could be tense, exhausting, and at times downright miserable. He worried the character would trap him, he fought to make Spock feel like more than a blank slate, and he sometimes felt squeezed between what the creators wanted and what he knew would ring true on screen. In other words, the man who made emotionless look effortless was often wrestling with it the hardest. Before we start, drop a comment and tell us which Star Trek character you would hate to be stuck playing for years and why. Because today, we're getting into why Leonard Nimoy hated playing Spock on Star Trek. The role that felt like a cage.
Spock? Hey, do the thing.
I don't do that anymore.
When Star Trek was still finding its footing, Nimoy was already uneasy about the core assignment: play a character who insists he does not do emotion. For an actor trained to communicate feelings through voice, timing, and expression, the idea of staying on one note was not just challenging, it sounded like a creative dead end. He didn't want Spock to become a stiff mannequin in a science fiction uniform. Early on, he pushed back because he could see the danger. If the audience only reads Spock as a cold robot, the character becomes a gimmick instead of a person. Nimoy wanted a way in, something human under the logic, even if it was buried deep. That tension surfaced during the first season, while the team was still defining what a Vulcan even was. Nimoy argued he did not know how to sustain that narrow lane week after week, and he seriously considered walking away before the job had even become famous. What made it worse was that the show's creator had a firm concept of Spock's purpose. The idea was simple. Spock is not an Earthman, and his contribution is intellect over emotion. That might work on a whiteboard, but on a set, it can feel like being told to remove half your instrument and still play the concert. Finding emotion inside the logic.
We need a formula. We've got to risk implosion.
Never been done. Understand, Jim. Spent a whole lifetime learning to hide my feelings.
The breakthrough for Nimoy was realizing that no emotion and controlled emotion are not the same thing. Once he reframed Spock as someone who feels plenty but refuses to show it, the performance suddenly had pressure, restraint, and inner conflict. Spock could be calm on the outside, with fighting storms on the inside, and that gave Nimoy something playable. That inner pressure did not vanish just because the idea clicked. Nimoy described how the bottled up feelings had to go somewhere, and he sometimes found himself bursting into tears off camera, even in everyday meetings. It's a striking image, the man playing the galaxy's most composed officer privately leaking emotion because his character could not. It also explains why Spock can feel surprisingly tender even when he's speaking like a logician. The warmth is not delivered through big speeches. It comes through micro-reactions, the slight softening around the eyes, the pauses where you sense he's choosing restraint rather than lacking feeling. Over time, that choice became Spock's engine. The audience could sense the effort it took for him to stay composed, and that effort is what made him relatable. Nimoy was not just being unemotional. He was acting the act of control, and that's a very different, much harder job. Fighting for control of Spock.
Do you mind us still seeing you as Spock?
No, I expect it'll go on for as long as I live. It's
don't
all right.
resent
It's
it?
okay. It's okay. I've gone through some good and bad times with it, but I've made peace with it. It's
Nimoy's frustration was not only artistic. As Star Trek grew, Spock's face and identity became a product, and that created new battles. During the second season, Nimoy found himself tangled in disputes over merchandising rights tied to his image. For an actor, it can feel like losing ownership of your own face, especially when the character is suddenly everywhere. Those conflicts also fed personal friction, particularly when Nimoy felt he was not being backed up the way he expected. When you combine creative stress with money disputes, the set can start feeling less like a team and more like a negotiation that never ends. At the same time, there were complaints about how the writing handled Spock as the show went on. When the scripts were sharp, Spock's logic and dry humor landed beautifully. When the scripts got sloppy, the character could drift into caricature, and Nimoy did not hide his irritation with that slide. This is one reason rumors about him leaving or being replaced could spread so easily. If the actor is unhappy and the studio is counting pennies, everybody starts imagining a swap. There was even talk in that era about other actors potentially stepping in, which sounds wild now, but it felt possible in the moment. The Roddenberry tension and the cost of fame.
The network didn't even want Spock on the show. The network said, we are very dependent on the numbers in the Bible Belt, and they will not accept in their homes a character who looks devilish with these pointed ears. So get rid of the pointed ears or get rid of the character. This was the network attitude. I was in jeopardy. My character was in jeopardy at the very beginning. And then, after the show had been on the air a few weeks, and they started getting so much mail for Spock, then the dictum came down from NBC. Oh, give us more of that guy. They love that guy. You know.
Star Trek was not just a show, it was a pressure cooker. Creative egos, long hours, network demands, and rising fame can make even a successful production feel like a grind. Nimoy's relationship with Gene Roddenberry could be complicated, with accusations and resentments bouncing around as the franchise grew larger than any one person. Fame also narrowed the way people saw him. Once Spock became iconic, strangers did not just recognize Nimoy, they recognized the character first. That can be flattering for a week, then suffocating for years. Nimoy did not want a single role to define his entire life in the public eye. That anxiety fed into the era where he publicly wrestled with the Spock identity, including presenting himself as more than one figure. The struggle was not only about pride, it was about survival as an artist. If the world only buys one version of you, it gets harder to take creative risks. But the irony is that this same intensity is part of what made the performance endure. Nimoy cared enough to fight about it. He was not sleepwalking through Spock. Even when he hated it, he was trying to steer it. The movies, the negotiations, and the parts of Spock that were his. Even after the original series ended, Spock kept pulling Nimoy back in. The movie era brought new leverage and new conditions. At different points, the question was not just will he return, but under what terms. Nimoy wanted room to explore other creative options, and at one point, a major deal point was being allowed to direct, which is how he eventually directed films in the franchise. That kind of bargaining tells you a lot. Nimoy was not only protecting his time, he was protecting his identity. Acting as Spock alone was not enough. He needed other lanes, like directing, to keep from feeling trapped in the same suit forever. Still, some of the most beloved Spock elements came straight from Nimoy, not from a boardroom. The Vulcan salute, for example, was inspired by a childhood memory from an Orthodox Jewish setting where he saw a priestly hand gesture that stayed with him. He reshaped that influence into something new, and it became one of the most recognizable gestures in entertainment. So the story is not he hated Spock, the end. It's that he fought Spock, reshaped Spock, and sometimes tried to run from Spock while also leaving fingerprints all over the character. The push and pull never really stopped. It just changed form as the years went on. Now it's time to hear from you. Do you think Leonard Nimoy's frustration came more from the way Spock was written and controlled behind the scenes, or from the way fame can trap an actor in one role even when they want to grow? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below.